This is episode 3 where I tell you how I cooked the mustard greens that my mother-in-law in Kentucky taught me how to make. As promised from episode 2, this is the story of when that happened. And as appropriate, I'm standing in my kitchen doing dishes right now as I tell you this story. This was 1986, 85, 86, probably 86. This was 86. And at the time, we had moved out of my mother and father-in-law's house, and we had rented a house up the road. But one day, Sallie told me that she would tell me how to make fried greens. So I went to her house, and she told me to go out to the garden and pick some mustard greens. So I went to the garden. I didn't even know what mustard greens were. And she showed me what it was, and I went out into the garden and I picked some. I put some she had a grocery bag, and I brought it in. She said, "Oh no, you're gonna need some more than that. That ain't near enough." So she sent me back out there with, I think, like 4 more. Anyway, I came into that little tiny trailer that I told you about in the last episode, and I had 4 or 5 bags brimming full of mustard greens. And she sat at the table. She had her oxygen on, and she told me how to make the fried greens. The first step was I needed to get the big canning kettle. It was about this big, tall, this big around, not kidding, because it's the kind you use for canning. And I set it on the stovetop, which was an electric stovetop with the 4 burners, and I put it on the biggest burner, and it was so big it wouldn't fit on that burner. It took up part of the one behind it. So I filled it up with water up till about this far from the top, and she said, "Now set that on to boiling," and I did. And while that was setting on to boil, it took a long time to put that much water on to boil. I took those greens and I emptied them into the sink of the trailer, and I washed them. She said, "Wash them real well, wash them real good. You don't want no dirt on them." So I washed them as good as I could, and then I put them into a big bowl like this, or bigger. And as I washed the greens, I went like that, and she said, "You have to get all the water off of them." So I got all the water, and I started to wring them out. She said, "No, you don't want to do that. You don't want to mash them down." So I didn't want to mash them down. I got all the water off. I washed all those greens. It took a long time, but by the time that was done, the water was boiling. So she said, "Now take them greens and put them all down in that kettle." And then I took a big spoon like this, and I kind of pressed those greens down into that kettle, and they boiled. And they boiled, and they boiled, and they boiled, and it started to become a rolling boil. In fact, as I recall, now that I'm telling you this, I couldn't fit them all into that first kettle because it had to roll a boil. So as those boiled and they got to be a really dark green, I took them out and I would transfer them over with a slotted spoon like this, and I would put them into a big bowl. And then I would do the second installment. And this continued, and I would boil and then take them out, boil and take them out. And so once they were all boiled and they all fit in a great big huge bowl, she said, "Now you have to boil them again." I said, "What?" She said, "Yeah, you have to do this 3 times. I'm like, "Oh, okay." So she told me to take the greens and make sure all the water was off, and I did, and I put them back into the kettle with fresh water and boiled them again. Now, on the 3rd time that I put those greens back into the kettle, as I was pouring them back in, I noticed that there was a big grasshopper. And I just looked at him, and all of his legs were there and everything. I just plucked him out and threw him away. As I continued to boil these greens, I took them out, and the end result was you didn't want them to have any water whatsoever on them so that you could fry them in the skillet. While those were boiling, she told me to get the big iron skillet. She had like 3, and I got the biggest one that she had, the most biggest. and I put it on a burner on the stove, excuse me. And she told me to go into the refrigerator and get some bacon grease. So I got the bacon grease out and I put some in the skillet, and then I took a big dollop of lard out of the 25-pound lard bucket that I told you about in the last episode, and I put that in there with some salt. And I put the burner on low. Although it was so hot in there, I was about ready to die. It was summertime, July hot in August. And although there was air conditioning in the trailer, it couldn't keep up because I was doing all that cooking and generating all that heat in the kitchen. So while the greens continued to boil, I heated up the oil in the skillet. And then I finally took the last batch of those greens and I poured off all of the water into the sink and then transferred with a spoon all of the greens into a big bowl. And I pressed them down just a little bit because you didn't want to mash them. That would have been bad to mash them. And as I pressed them down in the bowl, then I would turn the bowl a little on the side over the sink and I would get all the water out. So the greens were pretty well dry. In fact, I took some of them in my hands and I went like this just a little bit to wring them out just a little bit. Once it was that way, I could take a fistful of them and put them into the hot skillet and I fried them. Now, let me get this. I know it's dirty. We called this a pancake turner down in Kentucky. I know that's called a spatula, but that's what we fried them with in the skillet. We would fry the greens. And I fried the greens and kept frying them until the lard and the bacon grease started to get a little bit crispy. And you know how it starts to stick to your skillet? That's when I knew. And then the greens were starting to maybe start to stick a little bit to that skillet. She said, that's when they're done. So they were done. And I turned them out into a bowl. And that night for supper, now in Kentucky, dinner is lunch and supper is the evening meal, supper. For supper, it was Sallie and Redmond, her husband, my father-in-law, and he sat at the head of that table. Refer to that other episode 2, where I give a visual of what that trailer looked like on the inside and how big that table was in the kitchen. He sat at the head of the table. Sallie sat on this side of the table with her back to the wall. I sat across from her, and Kelly sat next to me. My husband sat next to me. I had also made some soup beans, fried taters, and pone cornbread, sweet cornbread. So as we were sitting there eating and we dolloped all that out in those greens, I said, Redmond, how's those greens taste? And them green? He said, yeah, man, them so good you can't hardly sit still eating them. And then I said this, wow, I'm so glad to hear that you like them, because something funny happened when I was cooking those. And they were still eating as I was telling them that. I said, as I was going through the last boiling on those greens, I found a grasshopper. And I just took him and plucked him out and threw him away. Well, their forks went down. They stopped eating and they all looked at each other like, what? And I could physically feel my husband moving away from me with his chair. And my mother-in-law sitting across from me said, now let me tell you something, little girl. We don't eat bugs. Next time that happens, you just dash out the whole thing. We ain't about eating bugs. And with that, they took all of the greens and they threw them out. That was a bone of contention for many, many years. And they didn't trust my cooking for a very long time after that. And like I said, it's been many, many years and we can laugh about it now, but I couldn't laugh about it for like the first 10 years of my marriage. So that's my story of learning how to cook mustard greens in Kentucky. And I learned to cook them and cooked them very, very well. And they were very good without bugs. So until next time, have a good day. See you next time.